a folded silk scarf, a heavy mahogany drawer that refused to slide open easily, and resting directly beneath both of them, a small velvet case that should never have existed in that room at all. Princess Anne opened it at precisely 2:02 on a chilly Tuesday afternoon inside Clarence House, and sitting quietly inside the dark fabric was a deep green emerald bracelet that the official royal collection had carried on its books as lost since 1997. Princess Diana's emerald bracelet, sitting quietly inside a locked dressing table drawer inside Queen Camilla's private quarters. Anne did not shout, she did not raise her voice to call for security, nor did she send for any of the nervous household aides waiting down the hall. She has never in her long life been a woman who fills a room with unnecessary noise when the facts of a situation have already laid themselves bare before her. She simply lifted the heavy gold piece out of its velvet bed, held it up against the tall window light for barely 4 seconds, and calculated in that exact span of time that somebody inside that palace had been telling a systematic lie to the entire family for nearly 30 years. The next 10 minutes are the absolute core of why this story has shattered the quiet surface of the monarchy. I am going to hold the exact details of those 10 minutes back just for a brief moment, because if I hand them to you right now, you will hear them merely as a colorful anecdote about a sharp, stubborn royal aunt. But if you stay with me, step by step, you will hear them precisely the way Camilla heard them when the door closed behind her. My name is Harold. I spend my days sifting through the silent, invisible machinery that keeps this family running, the internal inventory filings, the state archives, the security logs, and the historical registries that get quietly amended in the dark and hoped over by palace officials. What you are about to hear is the culmination of months spent piecing together a paper trail that spans 3 decades. By the time this story ends, you will understand exactly how an irreplaceable royal treasure with a dead woman's name on it walked out of a secured room and stayed invisible for 27 years. You will learn whose signature sits on the falsified registry page that made it vanish, and you will understand why the King of England sat down at his desk that same afternoon and signed a legal order that stripped a set of master keys directly off his own wife. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of what happened, we have to start with the afternoon itself. Princess Anne had not arrived at Clarence House looking for a constitutional crisis. She had arrived to do mundane administrative paperwork, which is perhaps the least dramatic sentence ever written about the royal family, but also the absolute truth. The household administration had recently been forced to open a thorough audit of Princess Diana's remaining personal effects after a single catalog tracking number came back mismatched from the central vault. One tiny line on one obscure page did not match the physical description of the object it was supposed to track. That is precisely how the greatest secrets in these grand houses unravel. Never with a dramatic, tearful confession, but always with a mismatched digit on a spreadsheet. Anne was the only logical choice to lead that audit, and everyone inside the building knew it. She continuously tops the official engagement counts year after year, a fact the national newspapers report every January like a routine weather forecast. But what the papers miss is that Anne routinely does the unglamorous, heavy administrative work that no camera crew ever films. She has zero personal interest in the material outcome. She is not in line to inherit these physical treasures, and for over 50 years she has remained the single member of that family who will speak the cold, unvarnished truth in a room where everyone else is treading on eggshells. If you want to understand why the entire royal household views Princess Anne with a mixture of profound respect and genuine fear, you need only look at 2 historical facts on the public record. In March 1974, an armed man ambushed her car on the Mall in central London, shot 4 people in her security detail, and attempted to drag her out of the back seat at gunpoint. When he ordered her to get out of the vehicle, she looked him in the eye and famously replied, "Not bloody likely." She was only 23 years old. Decades later, in November 2022, King Charles formally requested Parliament to expand the official list of councillors of state. The legislation sailed through the House of Lords in weeks, and the top name added to carry the king's sovereign authority in his absence was Princess Anne. She is the anchor of that family. So when a catalogue number came back wrong, the household handed her the keys and got out of her way. Nobody expected her path to end in Camilla's private dressing room. Camilla was away on official duties that afternoon. The private suite was utterly silent, wrapped in that distinct, heavy quiet that fills ancient palaces when their occupants are absent. Every step across the polished floorboards felt unnaturally loud. Anne approached the massive antique dressing table, pulled at the lower left drawer, and felt it catch on something inside. She worked it open with steady pressure, lifted away a folded silk scarf, and there it sat, the velvet case. The bracelet itself is an absolute masterpiece of gold, diamonds, and deep green emeralds. But it carries one specific feature that renders it unmistakable to anyone who knows its history: a small, visible join on the clasp where the gold had been repaired. Diana had accidentally snapped that clasp during a high-profile family dinner decades ago and had it privately mended. The join is instantly noticeable if you run your thumb along the underside of the latch. Anne did not need a magnifying glass. She was sitting at the very same dinner table the night Diana broke it. She pressed her thumb against the cold metal, felt the microscopic ridge of the repair, and in an instant, every single innocent explanation evaporated into thin air. This was not a replica. This was not a similar piece from the same jeweler. This was the exact bracelet that had vanished from the record in the dark autumn of 1997. And tucked directly beneath the velvet lining was something even more damning: an original yellowed inventory label bearing Diana's personal initials, and a date from years before Camilla had ever stepped into Clarence House as queen. That single piece of paper transformed a potential misunderstanding into an undeniable act of deliberate concealment. Nobody hides a piece of jewelry while keeping its original tracking tag unless they know with absolute certainty whose property they are holding. Whoever placed that case in that drawer knew precisely what it was, knew who it belonged to, and chose to lock it away under a scarf anyway. Anne did not hesitate. She picked up the velvet case, slipped the heavy bracelet into her coat pocket, locked the drawer, and walked back out into the grand hallway. She looked at the security officer stationed on the corridor and delivered a quiet 11-word instruction that chilled the blood of everyone standing nearby. Nobody enters this room. Not staff, not the household, not the queen. A terrified private aide rushed forward and asked who they should notify. Anne looked at him and gave a single name: Charles. Before the king had even risen from his desk at Buckingham Palace, word had already reached Camilla's inner office that Princess Anne had breached her private dressing room. Consider for a moment what that emerald bracelet represents, because it is essentially 4 entirely different objects depending on who is holding it in their hands. To the Central Royal Collection, it was merely a missing line item on a ledger, a set of precious stones logged under a tracking number. To Princess Anne, it was a vivid memory of a long-past family dinner, watching Diana laugh off a broken clasp and hold the loose stones safely in her palm for the rest of the evening. To Camilla, it was an unexploded bomb, a piece of evidence she had held on to, in complete secret, unable to display, unable to log, and unable to explain to a single soul. And to King Charles, it represented a terrifying door to a traumatic past that he had spent nearly 30 years desperately leaning against to keep shut. It is no secret that Anne and Diana were never close friends. That is not tabloid gossip. It is historical fact documented over decades. They were two radically different women who shared nothing in common except a famous surname they had both married into. One lived her entire existence under the blinding flash of international cameras. The other dedicated her life to avoiding that glare entirely. They were polite, professional, but deeply distant. And that is precisely why Anne's intervention carried such devastating weight. Anne did not retrieve that bracelet out of sentimental grief for Diana. She has no soft romantic memories of her former sister-in-law to defend. She retrieved it because the object carried a name on its label that was not the name of the woman whose drawer it was hidden in. Someone had taken a deceased woman's property, falsified state documentation, and tucked it away in a private room. When King Charles arrived at Clarence House, he did not wait to sit down before demanding to see it. He rushed into the room, held the gold band directly beneath the bright desk lamp, and ran his thumb over the clasp. He found the tiny repair instantly, confirming that he, too, recognized the piece immediately. Then he placed the bracelet onto the leather blotter and fell into a complete, deafening silence. Anne watched his face carefully. That silence was the most damaging response Charles could have possibly given. A loud denial would have been a stance. Confusion or surprise would have been a defense. But Charles offered only quiet recognition. He knew exactly what the bracelet was, and deeper than that, he understood instantly that its discovery in his wife's private quarters was about to tear open a wound that had taken nearly 3 decades to scar over. Meanwhile, just 2 rooms away, Queen Camilla was frantically pulling off her gloves, her face pale as she demanded to know from a senior aide whether Princess Anne had taken anything from her dressing table. The aide, caught in the middle of a constitutional nightmare, stood silent. He simply did not know what to say. The story grows even stranger when you examine the internal paper trail that followed that fateful afternoon. According to documented statements from household staff, Camilla had been overheard years earlier referring to an unnamed emerald piece as something she was protecting until the right time. Protecting for whom? No official transfer document existed in the state archives. No royal trustee had ever authorized her to hold the piece. And when Anne pulled the master registry from the central vault, she discovered that the bracelet had been marked with an official administrative note claiming it had been removed for specialist conservation. But when Anne's office contacted the master jeweler listed on that form, the truth came out: the workshop had never received the piece. There was no job ticket, no intake log, no shipping receipt, and no record of the bracelet ever entering their care. Someone had deliberately typed a false entry into the state register to explain away the bracelet's sudden disappearance, allowing the physical object to vanish into a private drawer. Charles cleared the room of all staff, sat his sister down, and practically begged her not to confront Camilla until he could explain the long, complicated history behind the object. Anne looked at her brother and refused to make a single promise. That hidden history traces all the way back to a single tense autumn evening at Kensington Palace in 1997, just weeks after Princess Diana's tragic passing. The emerald bracelet did not simply drift away into history over a period of decades. It vanished on one specific night, inside one specific room where every single item was being photographed, catalogued, and signed for by legal representatives. When a senior member of the royal family passes away, the household initiates what is known as a memorial inventory. A dedicated team of archivist officials goes through the deceased's estate piece by piece, logging descriptions, attaching tracking tags, and determining which items remain private family heirlooms and which return to the official state collection. In 1997, that process was conducted inside Kensington Palace. Because Prince William and Prince Harry were only 15 and 12 years old at the time, King Charles was granted temporary administrative authority over the disputed items. Picture the heavy, grief-stricken atmosphere inside Kensington Palace during those weeks. The mountains of flowers outside the gates were still fresh. The image of two young boys walking behind their mother's coffin was burned into the global consciousness. And inside the private apartments, a quiet team with clipboards was systematically sifting through Diana's wardrobes and jewelry boxes, writing numbers on paper tags. During that formal inventory, the emerald bracelet was photographed, documented, and placed inside a dark velvet box clearly labeled in black ink, reserved for Prince William. Late that evening, after the primary archiving staff had departed, Camilla entered the sorting room. A former household official present during that time documented a tense exchange that provides the key to everything that followed. Seeing the velvet box marked for the young prince, Camilla openly questioned why so many historic treasures were being permanently locked away for Diana's sons. Charles told her firmly that the jewelry was not her concern, but Camilla fired back with a sentence that would echo through the palace for the next 27 years. Diana's possessions will continue controlling this family until somebody finally decides where the past is allowed to end. Desperate to avoid a public scandal traveling through the household staff, Charles made a decision that night that would cost his eldest son his inheritance for nearly 3 decades. He ordered the remaining inventory boxes to be moved immediately into a private storage suite under his direct personal control. By the following morning, the velvet case marked with William's name had vanished from the central sorting table. No alarm was raised. No official investigation was launched. Charles simply assumed the piece was safely secured within his private estate, an assumption that in hindsight looks less like innocent trust and far more like a man deliberately choosing not to look too closely. Back in the present day, Princess Anne sat at the desk with a red pencil, comparing the original 1997 inventory register against the falsified records. The original entry clearly read, "Reserved for Prince William." The altered version read, "Removed for specialist conservation." The handwriting on that falsified document belonged to a former household equerry who, just 2 years after writing that line, was appointed to a high-ranking position within Camilla's private office. Anne placed the original 1997 photograph of the bracelet right next to the physical gold band resting on the desk. The exact same emeralds, the exact same gold weave, the exact same repaired clasp. She slid the falsified document across the table to King Charles and waited in total silence. Charles looked down at the handwriting of his former staff member, unable to offer a single word of defense. At that exact moment, an aide knocked nervously on the door and announced that the Queen was demanding access to her private dressing room. Princess Anne did not even look up from the papers. She looked at the aide and said coldly, "No." Camilla was not going back into that room until she came and stood face to face with her in the library. The final confrontation inside the king's private library was devoid of any royal polish or diplomatic pleasantries. No advisors were permitted in the room. No private secretaries were present to record polite minutes. Princess Anne walked into the library carrying the open velvet case in both hands. Camilla stood waiting beside Charles, her posture rigid. Anne placed the emerald bracelet squarely on the mahogany table between them, looked directly at Camilla, and asked the question that destroyed any possibility of a polite cover-up: Diana's bracelet. "Your locked drawer. Explain that to me." The enduring tragedy of this entire saga is not merely the physical loss of a golden bracelet for 27 years, but the immense emotional cost of the silence that surrounded it. As Diana wrote in the closing lines of her letter, love must always be the force that decides what a family keeps, what it forgives, and who ultimately holds the pieces of its past. Princess Anne's refusal to remain silent exposed a truth that had been buried under decades of palace politics, restoring a stolen piece of history to the prince it was always meant for, and proving that even behind the highest walls in the world, the truth eventually finds its way into the light.